I leaned against the front door, backpack heavy, heart heavier, and called out to my dad. No answer. The kitchen light flickered, but stayed empty. My existence had become a whisper in a house too loud to care, and that silence was finally mine. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, follow this story to the end and subscribe for more real-life family betrayal and triumph stories. I remember the day I decided I would leave as clearly as the crack in the living room ceiling. I was 19, but I'd already learned years earlier how being ignored felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My name is Isla Marino, and if life had taught me anything, it was that no amount of effort could make my father, Simon, notice me. My parents had always been polite, if distant. Dad buried himself in work, Mom in charity events, and my older brother, Damien, existed like a golden standard that I could never touch. Damien's accomplishments were celebrated with bouquets, parties, and Facebook posts that overflowed with exclamation points. I achieved straight A's in high school, won a state-level writing contest, and spent hours perfecting piano pieces that Dad never even glanced at. The reward was always the same: silence, that dull, grinding quiet that made me feel like I had never existed at all. Birthdays passed unnoticed. I learned to sit quietly at the table, pretending I didn't mind, while Damien got the attention, the gifts, the praise. My sister Nina, the youngest, was still a toddler, and even she earned indulgent giggles when she spilled her milk. I had long since stopped hoping for acknowledgement. But that evening, the realization struck me with the clarity of a slap. If I vanished tomorrow, no one would notice for days, maybe weeks. My absence would float through the house like an unnoticed draft. And then it occurred to me that this wasn't something that hurt anymore. It was confirmation. Confirmation of everything I'd always suspected. I didn't belong there, at least not in any sense that mattered to them. I packed my bag slowly, deliberately, like I was rehearsing a ritual I'd been preparing my entire life. A backpack of essentials, my savings from a summer job at the local bookstore, a few notebooks, my laptop, and a change of clothes. The key in my pocket clicked like the first note of a song I was finally free to write. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I simply stepped out the door, letting the familiar scent of stale coffee and dish soap fade behind me. The first night alone was terrifying. My small studio apartment smelled faintly of damp paint and old carpeting. The radiator coughed, groaned, and finally sputtered to life. I crawled onto my thrift store futon and stared at the ceiling, listening to my own breath, the quiet of my own space. No clattering dishes, no television hum, no footsteps crossing the hallway. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't swallow me, it welcomed me. My first job was at Nora's Cafe, a tiny place 2 blocks from my apartment. It was chaotic and greasy, with a perpetually squeaky floor, and a manager named Jocelyn who ran the cafe like a general marshalling her troops. She didn't care about my family history or my lack of experience. She just needed someone who could take orders, carry trays, and smile through the breakfast rush. I thrived. Every small victory, balancing a tray full of coffees without spilling, navigating the crowd during Saturday brunch, remembering Mrs. Klein's special oat milk order, felt monumental because it was seen, acknowledged, and mattered. I shared the studio apartment with Jasper, a roommate I met through a mutual friend. He was scruffy, funny in a quiet way, and didn't pry. The first morning, he left a note on the counter. "Coffee's on, don't spill." Simple, small, human, and it was the first time I felt like someone could see me without expecting anything in return. College started that fall. I enrolled at the city community college, juggling classes with work and learning to manage my own finances. Each day was exhausting, but in that exhaustion was a pulse of purpose. I had a schedule I built, responsibilities I controlled, and no one hovering over every mistake, no one to remind me I was invisible. Friendships came slowly, cautiously. I met Melina, a senior in the creative arts program in the campus media lab. She had an easy laugh and a way of seeing people without judgment. She roped me into helping with the student podcast, and for the first time, my ideas mattered. I discovered Evan in the computer lab C, patching broken laptops and listening patiently as I fumbled with software I didn't fully understand. Both of them became part of the life I was constructing, one where acknowledgement was earned by effort and care, not arbitrary preference. Some days, though, the old ache returned. A mother hugging her daughter at the grocery store, a father helping his son with homework, small glimpses of the warmth I'd been denied. At first, it stung. Then, slowly, I learned to observe without envy. I didn't need their approval to exist. I didn't need them to notice. I had my life of my own, and it was quietly, fiercely mine. Christmas came and went my first winter on my own. Damien's Facebook posts overflowed with photos of family dinners. I scrolled past without resentment, only a detached curiosity. The ache had softened. It was no longer a pull, only a memory, a faint shadow in the corner of my mind. One chilly evening, I came home from the cafe and found a note Jasper had left on the fridge. "You're doing fine. Keep going." No demands, no judgment, just acknowledgement. My chest swelled with an emotion I hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Not happiness born of spectacle or praise, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of survival and self-determination. It was then I realized something vital. Leaving hadn't just been an escape. It had been a declaration, a silent but resolute statement that I would not be erased, that I would not exist merely as an afterthought in someone else's life. I was done waiting for attention that would never come. I was done hoping for affection that had never existed. And as I stood by the window that night, echo curled at my feet, city lights reflecting in my eyes, I finally understood. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was whole, and that alone was enough.
Life settled into a rhythm I had never known before, one built entirely by my own hands. I woke each morning to the faint groan of the radiator, the city's hum through the cracked window, and Jasper's muffled cough from the bathroom down the hall. No one demanded attention, no one measured my accomplishments against anyone else's. It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. At Nora's cafe, the chaos became a kind of meditation. Jocelyn had a way of running the place that was demanding but fair. She noticed when a tray wobbled, when a coffee order was late, when a table got shorted a smile. But she also noticed when we did well. When I handled the Saturday rush without dropping a single order, she clapped her hands over her mouth and said, "Don't get cocky, but you're unstoppable." That one sentence, short and offhand, carried more weight than any family praise I'd ever received. I met Nadia during my first week of college. She was a teaching assistant for the creative writing program, a woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a smile that seemed to see through pretense. "You write like you're holding back," she said, leafing through the short story I had submitted. "Stop protecting your emotions from the page. Let them breathe." Her words lingered, and for the first time I felt someone recognized not only what I could do, but who I was beneath the surface. Friendships developed slowly but meaningfully. Melina, the senior I met at the media lab, became my anchor in the chaos of campus life. She had a laugh that could cut through tension like sunlight through storm clouds, and she had a way of validating your existence without being performative about it. She invited me to help with the student podcast, handing me tangled cords and glitching mics. Together, we coaxed sound out of chaos, a small triumph each time a broadcast went smoothly. Every compliment she gave wasn't hollow, it was recognition. Evan came into my life on a dreary Thursday afternoon. I had managed to crash a laptop that belonged to one of the professors, the screen frozen and unresponsive. He crouched beside me, fingers moving over the keyboard with quiet precision. "Most people panic," he said, eyes on the monitor. "You're methodical." That one word, spoken without judgment, felt like permission. Permission to be competent, to exist, to matter in a space entirely unrelated to my family. Living alone taught me survival in ways I had never anticipated. I learned how to budget each paycheck, stretching tips and wages to cover rent, food, and the occasional emergency. I learned that failure wasn't catastrophic, it was instructive. Burned a batch of cookies, learned the oven's quirks, overslept for a shift, set 3 alarms next time. Every small misstep was a step forward in a life I controlled. I decorated the apartment with a combination of thrift store finds and hand-me-downs from friends, a chipped lamp that Jasper found on the curb, a threadbare rug from my first paycheck, posters I had always wanted but never dared to hang at home. For the first time, I curated my space without interference, a tangible manifestation of autonomy. Every object was a tiny rebellion against the years I had been ignored. Evenings became a mix of work, study, and exploration. I walked the city streets with earbuds in, music as my companion, absorbing the flicker of streetlights on wet pavement. I explored bookstores, small cafes, and quiet corners of the university library. Every step reinforced the realization that my existence no longer required validation from anyone who had long ignored me. Yet, despite the autonomy, I was not impervious to memory. Sometimes I caught glimpses of a motherly warmth I'd never received, parents hugging children, friends coiling in laughter, and it hit me like a phantom pain. But those moments, fleeting and external, only strengthened my resolve. I would not depend on absent hands to construct my sense of self-worth. One winter morning, while trudging through a thin layer of frost on the sidewalk, I found a crumpled journal. Someone had left it on a bench, pages yellowed and worn. I flipped it open to read half-finished stories, doodles in the margins, and reflections that hinted at loneliness. For hours I sat there, reading The Invisible Life of a Stranger, and realized I had been cultivating my own invisible life with the same careful attention, the same small victories. Jasper was a constant but unobtrusive presence. He had his quirks, he left shoes in inconvenient places, cooked pasta like a mad scientist, but his attention never felt invasive. He never pried about family. He simply existed, shared grocery lists, and left notes in the kitchen. Milk is low, don't panic. At first, I laughed at the absurdity, then felt a flicker of gratitude. He wasn't a replacement family, he was a participant in a life I was crafting for myself. College became a proving ground. I enrolled in creative writing, sociology, and intro to marketing, juggling coursework with shifts at the cafe. My hands ached from typing, scrubbing, and lifting, but it was a different kind of ache that meant survival, that meant contribution. I took night classes on top of day shifts, stayed late at the library, and watched friendships grow. Melina, Evan, and Nadia became my chosen constellation, mapping out a sky I could navigate without parental approval. I discovered the small, almost imperceptible joys of daily life. A barista remembering my name and order, a professor complimenting my essay, Evan leaving a sticky note on my laptop, "You've got this." These gestures were small but weighty. I realized recognition didn't have to come with strings. It could be freely given and freely received, a stark contrast to the conditional attention I'd grown up with.
Winter turned into spring. My apartment blossomed with thrifted plants, a scraggly ficus perched in a cracked pot, a spider plant trailing across the windowsill. I painted one wall a muted lavender, a color my mother would have scoffed at. Each stroke reminded me that I could create beauty on my terms. No one could dismiss it or claim ownership. At the cafe, I became a reliable presence. Jocelyn trusted me with opening shifts, balancing registers, and training new hires. My confidence grew quietly. When someone yelled at the kitchen staff, I stayed calm. When a tray tipped over, I learned to catch it. Small triumphs piled upon each other until the girl who had been ignored for years felt seen, not by my family, but by the world I had chosen to inhabit. One Thursday afternoon, Melina dragged me to a student showcase, a gallery of photography and writing. The room was filled with nervous energy, the kind I had only experienced in silence before. Watching the students present their work, I felt a mix of envy, pride, and longing. But unlike the family I had left behind, these students didn't judge based on birth order or favoritism. They only judged on effort and authenticity, and that was enough. Occasionally, texts from home slipped through. My father's messages were brief, often vague. Damien asked about my grades. My mother inquired with empty pleasantries. I read them once, maybe twice, and then deleted them. The curiosity that flickered was tamed quickly by my hard-earned boundaries. Their words were insufficient to undo years of neglect, and I no longer wanted them to be. It was around this time that Evan asked me to help with a volunteer coding project for a local nonprofit. The project was complex, messy, and urgent. It required collaboration, patience, and improvisation, exactly the skills I had developed in the cafe, at school, and in my apartment. When our first successful test ran smoothly, Evan slapped my shoulder. "You're a machine, Isla," he said, and I let myself smile. For once, the compliment didn't feel hollow. It was earned, deserved, and true. By the end of my second year living independently, I had developed a kind of quiet pride. My life was structured, challenging, and rewarding. I had Jasper, Evan, and Melina, the people who had chosen to notice me, whose approval was not contingent on obligation. I had a small apartment, a reliable job, and a life I could call entirely my own. I had finally discovered a fundamental truth. Visibility is not given, it's created. Sometimes, late at night when the city hummed outside my window and echo curled at my feet, I would think about my parents. The silence of those early years had shaped me, taught me resilience, and instilled a sense of self that didn't rely on their recognition. I didn't feel bitterness, I felt clarity. I wasn't running from them anymore, I was running toward the life I had built. And for the first time, I truly understood the depth of freedom. Freedom was not in leaving. Freedom was in choosing to exist on my own terms, in crafting a space where my presence mattered simply because I existed. The old ache of being overlooked had not vanished. It had transformed into a quiet, steady determination, a determination that no one could diminish. By the spring of that year, I began sketching plans for the future. A degree in marketing, a small business of my own, freelance writing for causes I believed in. Each step was deliberate, a blueprint of autonomy. I no longer measured my worth against the backdrop of my family's neglect. I measured it against the life I could create, the relationships I nurtured, and the skills I honed. The girl who had once vanished unnoticed was thriving in plain sight. She existed in spaces she had claimed, and no one could take them away. Every cup of coffee served, every essay submitted, every conversation had meant meaning because it was part of a life that was entirely hers. By the time summer arrived, the city had warmed, flowers creeping along the sidewalks, and the streets were alive with movement. I walked to work in the early mornings, earbuds in, echo purring softly as I left my apartment, and felt a rhythm in my chest that no longer depended on anyone else's recognition. I was seen. I was alive. And for the first time, I knew exactly what it meant to be free.
By the time Isla had been on her own for nearly 3 years, the rhythm of her life had become second nature. The apartment smelled faintly of baked bread from her occasional experiments, and the heater's ticking was a familiar companion rather than a nuisance. She had grown into the routine of juggling classes, shifts at Nora's cafe, volunteer work, and quiet evenings with Evan, Melina, and Jasper. Her life had weight, texture, and a sense of purpose she had never felt at home. And then it began. The first message was innocuous, almost forgettable, a short text from her father. "Hope you're doing well." Isla read it once, then left it unopened on her phone. Her thumb hovered over the delete icon before she pocketed the device and carried on with washing dishes. She felt no pull, only the same calm certainty that had carried her through years of independence. A few weeks later, the messages became slightly more insistent. One line, "We haven't heard from you. Call us when you can." Another, "Mom asked me to check in. We hope everything is okay." Each ping on her phone reminded her that the people who had ignored her existence for years suddenly remembered it, and that memory was not gentle. It pressed against her chest like ice. Curiosity, though, has a way of gnawing through even the firmest boundaries. Isla found herself staring at the screen late one night after a shift. What could they want after all this time? A part of her wanted to toss the phone across the room, destroy the conduit of intrusion. Another part, more dangerous, wanted to answer, just to hear the words, just to see if they had really noticed her absence or if this was just another hollow attempt at connection. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she distracted herself with the mundane. A double shift at the cafe, a lecture on consumer behavior, a small coding error she spent an hour fixing. Yet the messages lingered in the periphery, persistent like shadows in the corner of her room. One evening, Evan arrived at the apartment carrying a box of groceries, his expression wary. "You've been quiet all day," he said, setting the bag down on the counter. Isla avoided his gaze, fiddling with a coffee mug. "Just tired," she muttered. He frowned. "It's more than that. Your phone keeps buzzing. From home?" Isla's jaw tightened. "Nothing important." He studied her for a moment, then simply nodded. "If you want to deal with it, I'll be here." He didn't pry, he didn't insist, and that alone was a relief. Some days, the greatest gift isn't advice, it's simply someone's presence without judgment. The messages didn't stop. By the 5th week, there was a call. Isla let it ring through 3 times before sending it to voicemail. Her father's voice, clipped and familiar, said, "Isla, it's been 5 years. We need to talk. Call me back." She listened to it once, then deleted it. The words rang hollow, urgent but unanchored, like a ship tossed on waves without a rudder. And yet she felt a strange tension inside, a tug she could neither deny nor fully embrace. Part of her wanted closure, a real acknowledgement of what had been taken from her, of all the birthdays, the missed congratulations, the years of quiet invisibility. Another part, the one she had nurtured carefully, whispered, "You don't owe them anything. You've built your own life. You are enough." Life carried on. Summer bloomed, sunlight spilling into her apartment in a way that made the threadbare rug glow golden. She baked bread for the first time, carefully kneading dough and setting it aside to rise, and in the quiet she felt a sense of control she had never had in her family's house. She had created a life worth living, a rhythm worth keeping. The messages remained, but they became background noise rather than an immediate threat. It was during a particularly slow Sunday afternoon at the cafe that she first saw him, the man who reminded her of home in a way that wasn't comforting. Her father walked in, alone, scanning the cafe with a mix of hesitancy and determination. Isla's heart did something strange. It skipped, then sank. He didn't notice her immediately, but when he did, there was a flicker of recognition, a hesitation as though he were trying to place her within the confines of memory. She didn't move. She kept the line of tables between them and continued to pour coffee, wash dishes, and refill sugar bowls. Her body tensed, but her mind remained calm. She had rehearsed this reaction countless times, neutral, distant, unengaged. He approached cautiously, his voice lower than she remembered. "Isla?" She didn't turn immediately. When she did, her expression was measured, unreadable. 5 years had passed. She had grown into someone entirely unfamiliar to him. "Hi," she said, flat. Can we talk?" His hands fidgeted with a cafe menu, the edge of it crumpling under his grip. "It's important." She weighed her options. Part of her wanted to run, part wanted to demand every apology she had ever deserved, but she also knew the power of listening. "Not here," she said finally. "Outside, 10 minutes." He nodded, relief flashing briefly in his eyes. They walked into the afternoon sunlight, the city buzzing around them. 5 years of absence stretched between them like a canyon, and Isla could feel the weight of it in every cautious step he took toward her. "Isla," he began, "I don't know how to start. I've missed so much." She held up a hand. "Don't. I'm not here for nostalgia or excuses. I need to know one thing." His brow furrowed. "What's that?" "Why now? Why after 5 years did you suddenly decide to call me? What's the reason?" Her voice was steady, but her pulse raced under the restraint. He hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "There's a problem with the family business. I can't manage it without you." The words landed like stones in her chest. The urgency in his tone was not for her, not for reconciliation. It was for utility. She felt the anger simmering slowly, the controlled heat of someone who had learned patience and boundaries. "I see," she said quietly. "You ignored me when I left, didn't notice my absence, didn't care for 5 years, and now you're calling because it benefits you." He shifted, unease cracking his composure. "It's complicated." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "It's exactly as it looks. You only want me for what I can give you, not for who I am." A silence fell between them, heavy and unyielding. People passed on the sidewalk, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on the man who had taken her existence for granted, who now tried to leverage a crisis to reclaim what he had ignored. Isla, please," he pleaded, his voice low, strained. "You don't understand. Things are serious. I need your expertise. I need your input." She took a breath, steady and deliberate, the kind she had learned over years of self-discipline. "I have built my life. I have a job I love, friends who see me, an apartment I've made my own. I am not a tool to solve your problems. I am not your fix for a family you've neglected. I am not available for you to demand my presence." He stared at her, a mix of shock and frustration crossing his features. For the first time, she realized that the power dynamic had shifted. In her family, she had been invisible, dispensable. Here, in this moment, she held the boundary. The years of silence, of quiet building of her self-worth, had crystallized into armor. You don't understand," he said finally, though the certainty in his voice had faltered. "I understand perfectly. I understand what it feels like to be ignored. I understand what it feels like to be invisible in the people who should matter most. I understand that you don't value me for who I am, only for what I can give. That is not my responsibility. That was never my responsibility." He opened his mouth to respond, but she shook her head. "No, I will not be part of this. I will not be guilted, pressured, or manipulated. You had your chance to notice me. You didn't. I've spent years building a life where I am seen, valued, and respected. That is my priority, not your business problems, not your regrets." He took a hesitant step back. The shift in the wind between them was almost tangible. She realized that the fear she had carried for so long, the fear of abandonment, the fear of conflict, had dissolved. It had been replaced by something steadier, self-respect, unyielding and clear. I don't know what to say," he admitted finally, voice softer now. I thought we could—" "Save your thoughts for yourself," she said. "I am done explaining, done negotiating, done justifying my absence or my choices. You have your life, I have mine. They do not intersect." She turned and walked away, the click of her shoes on the sidewalk echoing the finality in her chest. She didn't look back. The city stretched before her, alive with possibility, and for the first time, the presence of her past no longer cast shadows over her present. Back in the apartment, she dropped her bag by the door and sank into the worn couch. Evan entered moments later, noticing the tension. "Was that—" She shook her head, a small, ironic smile forming. "Nothing that matters anymore."
And it didn't. The weight of 5 years of neglect, the sudden intrusion of false urgency, had no power over the life she had built. She had learned the most crucial lesson of independence. Being wanted is not a necessity. Being respected, choosing when to engage, and maintaining boundaries, that was freedom. The messages stopped after that, replaced by silence once more. A silence that no longer stung. It was calm, protective, and earned. She no longer needed acknowledgement from anyone who had once disregarded her. She had cultivated a life filled with people who mattered, tasks that challenged, and spaces that belonged to her alone.
The days following the confrontation passed in a curious blur. Isla noticed a difference almost immediately. No more messages, no half-hearted attempts at guilt, no reminders of what she had failed to provide for her family. The silence, once loaded with abandonment, now felt protective, almost gentle. She had finally reclaimed the space that had always belonged to her. She spent the next morning in her usual routine, pulling herself out of bed before the sun fully rose, slipping on the worn sneakers she had patched more times than she cared to count, and brewing coffee that filled the small kitchen with a sharp, comforting aroma. Evan was already there, reading an article on his laptop, a soft smile acknowledging her presence without forcing a conversation. That small gesture, so ordinary, now felt revolutionary. "Sleep well?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "Better than I have in years," she said honestly, pouring herself a mug. He glanced up, nodding, and returned to his screen. It struck Isla how natural this felt, being seen without obligation, acknowledged without demand. It was a lesson she hadn't learned at home, but one she now lived every day. Over the next few weeks, Isla threw herself deeper into her world. She spent long hours at the cafe, mastering the rhythm of busy mornings and late afternoon lulls. She volunteered for extra shifts at the community center, mentoring teens who reminded her of herself at 15, quiet, overlooked, hungry for guidance. She even started an informal coding workshop on Saturdays, helping young women build websites for small businesses in the neighborhood. Each act, small or large, reinforced her growing conviction that her worth was self-defined, not assigned by absent parents. One evening, she returned to her apartment after a particularly grueling double shift. The city hummed around her, headlights blurring into rivers of gold and silver on rain-slicked streets. She stepped inside to the warm smell of soup simmering on the stove. Evan had beaten her home. "You made too much again," she laughed softly as she hung up her coat. "I made enough for leftovers, and you'll thank me later." The conversation meandered into quiet laughter, small stories about the day's absurdities, and discussions about what to cook next week. Nothing profound, nothing monumental, just ordinary life, steady and real. For Isla, that normalcy was its own kind of victory. A week later, she received an unexpected package at her apartment, a small, nondescript box with her name on it. Inside was a framed photograph of herself as a child, sitting on the steps of the old family home, smiling faintly. Taped to the back was a note: "I wish I had seen you then." Isla stared at it for a long time. 100 thoughts spun through her mind. Part of her wanted to burn it, toss it into the trash where it belonged. Another part wanted to cradle it, to acknowledge the tiny admission of recognition, even if it was too late. She set it on the windowsill, letting it catch the sunlight streaming in. The glass reflected the city lights at night, and she realized she didn't need the past to validate the present. That small note, the photograph, even the years of neglect, they didn't define her. She defined herself. The next day at the cafe, she spoke with Nora about her plans for the future. "I've been thinking about starting my own consultancy," she said, excitement threading through her words. "Something small at first, but independent. I want to build something that reflects me, not just fill a role someone else created." Nora smiled knowingly. "That's the kind of ambition I like to see. You've learned to work hard, Isla, and more importantly, you've learned to work for yourself." The words settled into her like sunlight after rain. She had spent so long trying to earn affection, recognition, and love from people who could never provide it. Now, every success, every small victory was hers alone to claim. She didn't need permission, she didn't need acknowledgement, she simply needed to keep moving forward. Winter came, and with it snow that blanketed the streets in a deceptive softness. Isla walked home one evening after closing the cafe, Evan at her side. Their conversation drifted easily, punctuated by laughter and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The city felt different in the quiet, a space she could inhabit freely, where the past no longer dictated her steps. As they reached the apartment, Isla paused at the doorway, looking out over the street. Streetlights reflected off the snow, painting the world in gentle hues of gold and silver. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it might have been like to grow up in a family that saw her, truly noticed her. The ache was there, fleeting and manageable, like a ghost brushing past. But she didn't linger. The apartment behind her was warm, filled with the people who had chosen to be present in her life. The life she had built was real, earned, and visible. That mattered far more than any fantasy of the family that had ignored her. Over the next months, her father's attempts to contact waned. Occasional messages arrived, brief and perfunctory, but she no longer felt compelled to respond. When curiosity tempted her, she reminded herself of the clarity she had earned. Her life was hers. She owed no explanations, no appearances, no return to a system that had once dismissed her entirely. In her own apartment, she found small joys in daily rituals, brewing coffee and listening to Evan read aloud from books they both loved, the faint strum of Jasper's guitar from the neighboring apartment, Melina's texts about her podcast edits, and the quiet satisfaction of a spreadsheet perfectly balanced or a project successfully completed. These were the rhythms of a life chosen and cultivated.
One evening, while preparing dinner, Isla caught a glimpse of herself in the kitchen window's reflection. She saw someone steady, self-assured, and quietly triumphant. The girl who had been invisible at home was no longer invisible anywhere. She had not only survived, she had thrived. It was in that reflection that Isla realized the full scope of her journey. She had left a house where silence had been neglect and turned it into a life where silence was peace. She had replaced absence with presence, indifference with intentionality, and neglect with care, both for herself and for those she allowed near her. By the time she turned 25, Isla opened her consultancy. It was small, but thriving, filled with projects that aligned with her values and people who respected her work and boundaries. She had mentors who guided without demanding, colleagues who collaborated without undermining, and clients who valued her expertise rather than her willingness to conform to expectations. She still carried the occasional pang when she saw family posts online, birthdays celebrated, graduations attended, vacations documented. But the sting was soft, like the fading warmth of sunlight as evening falls. She no longer measured her worth against their recognition. She had constructed a life that was complete in itself. One evening, sitting on her balcony with Evan, a cup of tea in hand, Isla reflected on the journey. "It's strange," she said, her voice soft. "I spent years waiting to be noticed, and now I notice myself, and that's enough." Evan nodded, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You're more than enough. You've built something real." And she had. Each brick of her independence, each late night of study or work, every choice she had made to prioritize herself over neglect had formed a life she could stand in proudly. She had been invisible once, but now she was seen, by herself first, and that was all that mattered. She glanced at the phone on the table. Another message from her father had come through earlier that day. "We hope you're well. Call if you want to talk." Isla considered it for a moment, thumb hovering above the screen. Then, with deliberate calm, she placed the phone face down. There was nothing to respond to, no obligation to bridge a gap that had long since closed. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was earned. It was steady. It was a signal that she had chosen herself, her life, and her peace. She took a deep breath and let it fill her lungs, let it settle into her bones. Outside, the city lights twinkled, indifferent yet beautiful. Inside, the apartment was warm, alive with quiet conversation, laughter, and the faint, comforting aroma of home-cooked meals. Isla leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders. She had survived neglect, abandonment, and manipulation, and emerged whole. And in that moment, she realized the truth she had been chasing all along. It had never been about her father's recognition, her mother's attention, or even their delayed apologies. It had been about her own acknowledgement, her own voice, her own ability to claim her existence. She had done that in spades. As night settled over the city, Isla felt a rare kind of contentment. A life built deliberately, lived authentically, and defended fiercely was not just survival, it was triumph. And for the first time in her life, she could rest fully and without reservation in the certainty of her own worth. She glanced at the phone on the table. Another message from her father had come through earlier that day. "We hope you're well. Call if you want to talk." Isla considered it for a moment, thumb hovering above the screen. Then, with deliberate calm, she placed the phone face down. There was nothing to respond to, no obligation to bridge a gap that had long since closed. The silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was earned, it was steady. It was a signal that she had chosen herself, her life, and her peace. She took a deep breath and let it fill her lungs, let it settle into her bones. Outside, the city lights twinkled, indifferent yet beautiful. Inside, the apartment was warm, alive with quiet conversation, laughter, and the faint, comforting aroma of home-cooked meals. Isla leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders. She had survived neglect, abandonment, and manipulation, and emerged whole. And in that moment, she realized the truth she had been chasing all along. It had never been about her father's recognition, her mother's attention, or even their delayed apologies. It had been about her own acknowledgement, her own voice, her own ability to claim her existence. She had done that in spades. As night settled over the city, Isla felt a rare kind of contentment. A life built deliberately, lived authentically, and defended fiercely was not just survival, it was triumph. And for the first time in her life, she could rest fully and without reservation in the certainty of her own worth. She smiled quietly to herself, raising her cup to the glow of the city below. I am seen, I am enough, I am here. And for the first time, that was more than enough.